Okay, I'll admit everybody.
Perfect. So welcome everyone to the May COVID Information Commons. My name is Kenya Pujols and I am the COVID Information Commons Program Manager. I am delighted to be here today, especially as we might know today we're celebrating the Mental Health Awareness Month. And today we're hosting the first thematic webinar about behavioral and social sciences insights during the pandemic. As you might know as well, the pandemic has increased the psychological stress on individuals. In particular, we have witnessed worsening of anxiety, panic, depression, fear, social unrest, just to name a few. And behavioral and social sciences can provide recommendations to align human behavior with public mandates. And that's why we have invited 4 experts who have been doing research in this topic. So first, let me tell you a little bit about the KIC. Actually, before we tell you a little bit about the KIC, I want to let you know that the Northeast Big Data Hub and the COVID Information Commons welcome everybody and strives to provide an environment that is free of harassment, so you can find this information that we will be sharing in the chat. And now let me tell you a little bit about the KIC. We call it the KIC, it's the COVID Information Commons. This is a COVID-19 research collaboration platform to enable and facilitate knowledge sharing and collaboration across various COVID research efforts. The KIC is brought to you by the Big Data Innovation Hubs and funded by the National Science Foundation. We now have close to 2,000 NSF awards on the KIC database, and we're planning to add thousands of NIH awards this year. Every month, the KIC brings together scholars from all over the country to share their research findings in the form of lightning talks. Each scholar will also engage the community directly, answering questions about their work during the Q&A section at the end of the presentations. The KIC community includes thousands of individuals representing about more than 600 institutions. And since July 2020, we have hosted 19 webinars with more than 6,000 participants. All these lightning talks from all these scientists have been transcribed to English, and also we have been translating many of them to Spanish and adding accessibility features. So I would also like to welcome Florence Hudson, our Northeast Big Data Innovation Hub's Executive Director, to tell us a little bit more about the KIC.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kenya. And Kenya just joined us at the end of January in 2022, and we're really delighted to have her as our KIC program manager. And Lauren Close is also on the call. She's our operations and communications manager. So we're delighted that the COVID Information Commons has already brought value to PIs across the country and around the world to enable researcher collaboration. And that's really what we're focused on. We were very busy when we first got the Rapid Award from NSF in May of 2020, delivered the minimal viable product in July of 2020, and it's been growing since then, as Kenya said, up to almost 2,000 awards now. Our plans with the COVID Info Commons Extension Award that we received in October for 4 more years, in October of 2021 to go through September 2025, is to continue to update the KIC database every month, which we do. We just updated it again this week for May. And then we're planning to bring in the NIH awards related to COVID as well. In the future, we're also planning to create new metadata and data search and discovery mechanisms and work with some of the Open Knowledge Network and Open Knowledge Graphs that NSF has been funding in COVID and health related areas. We're very delighted that Kenya's brought with her a number of really cool ideas. One is to have these thematic workshops. We do multidisciplinary workshops, which NSF really likes because it forces us to collaborate across the silo we tend to be in and may get to new innovations, but also we can go deep in certain areas and themes like in the social and behavioral themes and see if there's more that we could do together collaborating, perhaps create a working group, perhaps plan on having a workshop later this year. She's going to be planning our first annual KIC workshop. And we also could end up writing a paper together or whatever it is. So to further the research collaboration, further the research and help it transition to practice. So we're delighted that you could join us. Tell your friends, this is open, free, your tax dollars at work, anybody could join in. And we're always looking for NSF, NIH, CDC, AHRQ funded PIs that would like to present their COVID research, so they can contact us as well. Thank you so much, Kenya.
Thank you, Florence, for those words. And thank you to Lauren Kloss, who's also providing some support during the webinar and who will be managing the chat during this event. So now moving on, I would like to introduce the speakers for today. We have four amazing, fantastic scientists who have been doing a lot of research in behavioral social sciences during the pandemic. We have Lindsay Richland, Michael Rosenfeld, Michaela Mayer, and Ming-Swan Elaine. So let's actually begin. And I would like to invite first Lindsay Richland. If you can please begin your presentation, that would be great. I'm going to stop sharing so that you can share your screen. Okay, so if you want, I can share. I can also project this screen for you.
Sorry, I lost my mute button while I was doing this part, so hopefully this will work. Okay, you see it?
Perfect.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you so much. I'm really pleased to be here. It's really an exciting opportunity to talk about some of the work we've been doing and to talk about the different and to hear about the different ways that the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, has impacted our social systems. And I'm really going to talk in particular about our educational systems. And I'm a psychologist, so I'm really looking at mechanisms of learning. So thinking about really specifically what kinds of ways might the anxiety and sort of the feelings of worries and pressure that are impacting students' lives, and trying to think about how those might be impacting student learning. And I'm going to talk about sort of the sort of emergency moment we had when everything suddenly went online, but also insights, more broadly for learning context. So as you, I'm sure, recall about the spring of 2020, we had this emergency moment where everything had to move online. Higher education moved online, schools, both K-12 and higher education had to move to different sorts of online education. So I'm talking in particular today about the higher education at the undergraduate level, and we moved, very quickly to, I say Zoom here, but different sorts of technology-based instruction at home. Much of it included synchronous Zoom lectures. So these were lectures that were very much like you would have gotten in the classroom, but they're online. And there are affordances there, right? You sort of have this some real opportunities in that you have access for many students. You have a way to reach students. Everyone has the possibility of engaging through chat or through, so it wasn't sort of the kind of place where you suddenly had no connection to students. Other ways that this was done was having recorded lectures, which were very often posted so students could engage with them at their own time. So this is a particular mode of doing online instruction. But as we know, this kind of opportunity also is the direction that many think education's going. So higher education has a lot of flexibility when it's offered in an online forum and an online platform. Many affordances with flexibility. So these have these sort of big implications. But at the same time, there also are concerns. At the moment when it was an emergency, we had the infamiliarity piece, but we also have, this concern that we want to make sure we keep higher order thinking going. We want very strong lessons, right? We want to maintain sort of a quality in this instructional practice. And so in my lab, we think a lot, Science of Learning lab, at UC Irvine, we think a lot about higher order thinking in the 21st century. We want students to be doing, sort of the top of Bloom's taxonomy. For those of you guys who are familiar with this taxonomy, a lot of people use it in terms of thinking about quality of instruction. It was originally designed as a mode of analyzing assessment. But we think about sort of memorization as this bottom level here. And, these as you go up the rungs, you're talking about more complex cognitive work. Now, we want complex cognitive work for our students, but our brains and the parts of our brains that are in charge of doing this complex work are also the parts of the brain that are involved with things like worries, thinking about the world, thinking about, the many demands on students. And so if you're at a moment of a pandemic or, other systemic things are going on for you, you may be really loading those resources. So mechanistically, we can think about executive functions as this brain region located in your frontal lobe that's involved in much of the higher order thinking that we do. And this is a limited cognitive resource system. We don't have unlimited ability to hold lots of things in mind and think about them and pay attention to one thing at once. So these are involved in controlling attention, keeping ourselves focused on tasks, inhibiting distraction. It actually takes work, right, to not attend to that flashing light or your dog barking or something in the other room, right? It's involved with switching between tasks. So if you're thinking about one thing, you have to stop thinking about that and think about the new one, and also holding information in mind. So I'll give you just a very quick example so you can feel that feeling. Suppose 5 days after the day before yesterday is Friday. What day of the week is tomorrow, right? So it's kind of maddening, you're like 5 days after the day before yesterday. Okay, so this is a lot of mental work that you're doing. So think of a student in a classroom during a pandemic thinking about the many maybe home fears, maybe their health fears, maybe family things going on, maybe fears of being suddenly online and their technology is not adequate. Maybe their internet is making them anxious, right? So there's many things that can be going on at the same time. Now, one more mechanism I'll throw at you is the idea of mind wandering. And this, of course, is something that we think about colloquially. We talk about zoning out, right? This is something you're probably all familiar with and hopefully you're not doing right now. And it's, very common. But cognitively, it's really an interesting phenomenon. We think it may do some things for us for creativity purposes, but it really does a lot for us for missing information when it's being put out in front of us. And so we want to think about, this is something that happens, but it's a mechanism that sort of, if we don't have your executive function sort of highly engaged, you can see this mind wandering happen, which might be reducing learning. So what we were interested in is thinking about inequities in anxiety and pressures and worries related to pandemic or related, but this has implications for our broader context in terms of the social inequities of anxiety and pressures, and looking at relationships to learning with mind wandering and a load of executive function as potential explanatory factors for what that difference is. So we wanted to know whether can an environmental or context factor lead to distress and systematic changes? Okay, and I know I'm actually running out of time, so I'll get to the data. So if we're talking about these kinds of systematic loads, we can think about this moving from distress to distraction. Okay, so I'll talk about 2 studies with undergraduates. We have a large undergraduate student bodies that were tested using survey data. And these are from public institutions and in California. And we have students these are coming from Hispanic serving institutions with high numbers of first generation students. So we have a pretty diverse population in the sample. And we gave a bunch of different measures to understand stress and anxiety relations and sort of their feelings in that moment. And we had them learn from an e-learning instruction. So this was a controlled video, so that way we actually knew what they were all getting as their inputs, right? And then we did assessments of their learning, and we assessed their level of mind wandering. And I will talk about that. But basically what we see, this is from the first study we did, and we see a very interesting large distribution. What you see here is the lighter color percentage of these are the percentage of students who were a little bit worried, but not too worried. The darker, as they get darker, you get sort of higher on the clinical scale of distress. And these very dark ones are very distressed. The sort of medium dark are much higher than we'd hope in an undergraduate population. And so this was from the first study that was collected in 2020. And actually, I'll show you in the second study that we ran, this was a much larger population that was run in the fall of 2021. You actually see these numbers are getting higher. So stress was going up in our student population. And importantly, these were systematic. So what you see on the left here, this is the same, these are the same numbers, in that stress, in that relationship, from not very stressed to very stressed, broken down by categories of students. So we have men versus women. So women were showing a lot more higher in that worry index. Latinx versus non-Latinx, you see Latinx students being at a higher worry level. First generation college students versus continuing generation college students. First generation students were showing a much higher level at this more serious level. And then when you put these intersectional inequities together, you have first generation Latinx women showing the highest level of anxiety and pressure. And they were worried about lots of different things, which I'll be happy to talk about in the Q&A. I don't have time to go through here. They were worried, some about technology, many about the social obstacles to learning, not being with their peers, being separated. And really, then we looked at the relationship between all of these worries and their learning. And what we find is that this was systematic and this was important. So the level of worries that you had led to lower learning. The level of worries that you had led to higher mind wandering, and that actually mediated this learning effect. And what we see, as I showed you, is that these more intersectional identities had the highest level of worry, meaning that this could actually lead to systematic differences in who's learning what from the exact same lesson. Now, we did a second study where we added the last piece, which was mindfulness, right before the instruction. So we added a prompt where we added a short video. This was 2 minutes, and it was just a reminder, to take a breath and sort of be mindful of one's thinking and one's attention. And really, so in the second study, we wanted to see whether we replicated the same phenomenon or whether, these original findings we saw were related to the rapid transition to online learning. And we want to see if we could ameliorate these a bit. And basically, in this one, we have a larger sample, but we see really the same phenomenon. And so I will just summarize to say that we saw that anxiety and situational worries, particularly related to the COVID-19 pandemic, led to higher mind wandering, led to lower learning. We did find, and I didn't have time to talk about this last piece, but introducing reminders to be mindfulness and changing features of the learning setting. We also tried one with using more visual cues. All of that actually disrupted the relationship. So we were able to reduce the amount of mind wandering when we added mindfulness or added sort of extra support cues during the instruction and the lesson. So what this suggests to us is this is an important problem. It's important during the COVID-19 pandemic. It may have implications as we move forward into the future world, as we're still grappling with anxiety related to the pandemic and other systematic inequities like unequal access to healthcare and funding and all of these other social pressures we know about that may be leading to differences in learning outcomes. And I'll just thank my team, thank the funders, thank National Science Foundation.
Thank you very much, Lindsay, for these great insights. I would love to learn more about during the Q&A section about all techniques that maybe you and your team can recommend for e-learning and to decrease the stress in students. But to the audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask any questions in the chat because we will be hosting a Q&A section at the end of all the presentations. But for the speakers, if you want to answer any of the questions in the chat, you are also free to do so. But I might also, maybe at the end, I might also ask you again to the question just to have a discussion between all the speakers. So now I would like to invite Michael Rosenfeld, if you can please share your screen, that would be great.
Absolutely. There we go. All right. I want to start out by thanking my collaborator, Sonia Hausen, and the wonderful National Science Foundation that has supported this research over quite a few years. What I'm going to be talking about today is a longitudinal study called How Couples Meet and Stay Together. It's a study that has 3 waves of panel data. Today, we're going to be focusing on the 2020 wave, but there's also a 2017 wave of these same subjects and a 2022 wave that just got back from the field. We asked people questions about how their romantic relationships responded to the great coronavirus pandemic. We had open and closed-ended questions. I want to draw your attention to the open-ended question because we're asking people to explain in their own words how their relationships responded to the pandemic. And I think that's important because people can explain what's going on in their own lives more easily than we can infer those causes from other variables. There are 2 big theories that have been advanced with regard to how relationships are going to be impacted by the coronavirus pandemic. The predominant one in every way is stress theory. So stress theory predicts that partnered adults will report that the pandemic made their relationships worse, that people will describe anxieties, stress, disputes, and disagreements with their partners, that women in heterosexual unions will report worse effects of the pandemic because of the gender division of labor. And there are many more citations for this than I can squeeze into a slide, but what I want to call your attention to is that the actual empirical evidence for the everything getting worse stress theory is not that great. Suicide apparently went down in 2020 compared to 2019. And there's this Van Winkle et al. Paper that found a sharp decline in depression during the pandemic in 11 European countries. Which isn't to say that people don't experience stress and anxiety, but the stress and anxiety effects of the pandemic are not so clear. So that's the first thing. There's this family resilience theory. This is theory number 2 that I think has a lot to teach us about this situation. Family resilience theory predicts that partnered adults will experience positive relationship effects of the pandemic due to solidarity in the face of an external threat, and that when asked, people would describe mutual meaning-making, solidarity, and the benefits of more time together. The family resilience theory has a research cousin in disaster studies, which came out of sociology with a key finding that disasters were mostly accompanied by improvements in social relationships between people in primary unions. And that's important. We might expect, for instance, that people spending more time together at home with their partners might have some positive things to say about that. And people working from home might see some benefits to less commute and more time together. So there's reasons to suspect that there might be positive effects on relationships of the pandemic. Let's look at some data. So in the closed-ended question, we asked people, simple question, how did their romantic relationship respond to the pandemic. And most people said no change, but a lot more people said their relationship was better off than worse off during the pandemic. So that's the first thing I want to call your attention to. Men and women in hetero unions report basically indistinguishable results. They both were more likely to say that the relationship was better. People living with children under 13, of course, they had a little bit more stress and work to do during the pandemic. There's no doubt about that. But even people living with children under 13 were more likely to say relationship was better. People with college degrees have the kind of jobs that are easier to do from home, more flexible. They were a little more likely to say relationship was better, but even people without college degrees also about 3 times more likely to say relationship was better than that it was worse. One of the fears that people had at the beginning of the pandemic was that people in abusive relationships would be living in a kind of a nightmare scenario. And the point I want to make about relationships and relationship quality is that while over the course of a person's life, there may be more bad relationships than good ones, we spend a lot more time in the good ones. And therefore, a cross-section of relationships tends to have a lot more relationships where the quality is excellent than otherwise. So if we look at what people said about the relationship quality in 2017, and we look down at the sample size here, there's a lot more people who are still partnered in 2020 who said their relationship was excellent in 2017 than there were more than 10 times more than people who said it was fair, poor, or very poor. And needless to say, the people who were in poor relationships, they were worse off during the pandemic because relationship was bad. But there's a dramatically larger number of people who said relationship was excellent in 2017, and those people are better off in 2020 than they were before. Okay, what did people say about this? One man wrote, "We're spending 100% of our time together, so it's a good thing that we're pretty much in total agreement in terms of housekeeping, respecting boundaries, and risk tolerance." And by the way, a lot of the positive outcome of this pandemic for relationships was people having a unified front with respect to public health and the pandemic and masking and so on. 29-year-old woman married to a man wrote, "We've had so much more time to spend with each other. Love is spelled T-I-M-E." Okay. Even people who were opposed to public health advice about the pandemic, if they were both in agreement on that opposition, that was a positive thing for them. So this 37-year-old man wrote, "We have the same thoughts about how the response to COVID is blown out of proportion and it's all political," right? As long as the two people in the couple are in agreement about the situation, they have a unified front. That unified front strengthens their relationship. On the other hand, if the two people in the relationship disagree about what to do about the pandemic, this has a really negative effect on the relationship. So this is a 22-year-old woman in an 8-year-long non-cohabiting relationship who wrote, "A big wedge has been driven between us and how exactly to handle the virus. I want to wear a mask, gloves, limit exposure as much as humanly possible. I wipe down surfaces and use hand sanitizer. He thinks I'm being, in his words, ridiculous and paranoid. If it weren't for store policy, he would probably never wear a mask. He doesn't think it's a concern, is always quoting data on how non-lethal it is. That's why I've seen him once in the past 7 months." Here's a pro tip. If your partner only wants to see you once in 7 months, things are not going great. So what does it mean? In the political rhetoric about how the US has faced the pandemic, we often hear about how divided we are as a country, and that division is real. Most people writing about how the pandemic and the lockdowns and the school closures would affect relationships were predicting some kind of social, relational, and mental health disaster. At the couple level, however, our data show that relationships are resilient. Most American couples were either sheltered in the normalcy of home, describing no change to their relationships, or else they were using the pandemic as an opportunity to build trust and make meaning together with their partner. We're not overlooking the terrible mortality effects of the pandemic. The pandemic has been historically terrible. We're simply arguing that couplehood is an underappreciated reservoir of potential social defense against this pandemic and against any kind of disaster, as the family resilience scholars would have predicted. So, important caveat, does the subjective sense of couple solidarity lead to objective, better outcomes? We are trying to figure that out, and I will leave it there.
Thank you very much, Michael. This was a great presentation. I love how you quoted all what people were saying about the relationships during the pandemic. And as you noted also in your paper, isolation together is an opportunity for solidarity. So I really love that and would love to learn more about your research findings at the end of this presentations. So now I would like to invite Michaela Meyer, if you can please share your screen and begin your talk.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Michaela Meyer, and I'm a PhD student at Carnegie Mellon University in the Statistics and Public Policy program. And today I'm going to be presenting on work that I did with 3 now master's alumni from CMU, as well as Dr. Amelia Haviland and Dr. Daniel Nagin, on how crime rates changed during the COVID-19 pandemic and during 2020 as a whole. So we hypothesized for our project that the events of 2020 were associated with changes in crime rates. So when we think about when the pandemic started and lockdowns began across the country, people's mobility was restricted. So people were sometimes not going to their workplaces, people weren't out and about as much socializing. And so we hypothesized that potentially this could have been associated with a change in crime rates. And similarly, then once these pandemic lockdowns lifted in places, perhaps that also then was associated with a potentially different association in crime rates. And not only was there the pandemic to contend with in 2020, but also coincidentally, as a lot of these pandemic lockdowns were being lifted, this was around the same time that George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis at the hands of police. And so as a result of George Floyd's murder, there were a number of protests that were held across the country. And we were curious about whether or not these events could have also been associated with changes in crime rates. In terms of what we're contributing to the literature, there have been a number of papers that were written about COVID-19 and the pandemic and changes in crime rates. But besides Rosenfeld et al. In 2021, which was using more time series methods and change point analyses, we're the first people to analyze crime trends following the killing of George Floyd. And so we look at 2020 as a whole, whereas a lot of studies were looking at the months just following the beginning of the lockdowns. We also analyzed trends for multiple crime types across multiple cities, while most of the previous literature and articles were examining fewer crime types, so maybe just 1 or 2 at a time, and also looking at, say, 3 or 4 cities. We also introduced an openness index that measures the restrictiveness of lockdowns in a given city. So we were using information from the counties themselves, and we had various industries. We rated these industries as either being open, semi-open, or totally closed. And then using this openness index, we tried to see if there were changes in crime rates. I won't have time to talk about those analyses during my presentation today, just for the sake of being within the 10 minutes, but I'd be happy to talk about this more during the question and answer session. So for our study, we were looking at crime data from 28 of the 70 largest US cities. These 28 cities were the cities that made daily or weekly level data publicly available for all of 2018 and 2019. And this is actually a mistake. It's actually all of 2020 as well. We were using population data from the US Census Bureau's sub-county resident population estimates to be able to scale our crime rates to these population numbers. The 5 crime types that we were studying were homicides, auto thefts, burglaries, robberies, and larcenies. And these are 5 different FBI Part 1 crime types. There are 2 other Part 1 crime types, aggravated assault and rape, that we weren't able to study in our analyses. And this is because the data quality for both of these crime types was quite poor for many cities across the country. Again, I'd be happy to talk about this more at the end of the presentation. So for our analyses, we were using a Poisson regression model. And so because we were dealing with crime counts, we believed that it was easiest to just model that as a Poisson regression model where we're trying to measure this lambda parameter as a regression model. And so the different subscripts here refer to the city, where we had 28 cities again, the different weeks, and the year, 2018, 2019, and 2020. And for each crime type, we had a separate model. So the covariates that we're including in this model are an offset term for the population, which allows us to take into account a city's population when looking at its crime rates, a city fixed effect, a fixed effect for the year, and a fixed effect for the month as well. But the four coefficients that were most important for our analyses, and we were most interested in learning more about, were these four different periods of 2020. So we grouped the months of 2020 into these four different groups. And these are the pre-pandemic period, which was January and February, the lockdown period of March to May, the summer protests of June to August, and the end of the year, which was September to December. So on the next few slides, I'm going to be focusing on just these coefficient estimates that are highlighted in blue on this slide. So beginning with homicide rates, these plots on the next few slides are all going to be set up quite similarly. So I might eventually start to breeze through the next few slides, but the y-axis is reflecting a multiplicative change in the crime rate. So in this case, it's the multiplicative change in homicide rates. There's a dashed line at 1, because if there was a multiplicative change of 1, that would mean that for that time period, there wasn't a statistically significant change in the crime rates compared to the previous years. The dots on these plots refer to the point estimates from our models, and then we're also including 95% confidence intervals, which are the ends of these plots. And so what we find for homicide is that throughout the entire year, so not just during the lockdown and afterwards, but for the entire year, there was an increase in homicides in 2020, which is relevant to point out because some of the literature has suggested that homicide rates rose in 2020 purely because of lockdown related events or things that happened later on in 2020, but we also saw that homicide rates were elevated pre-pandemic. In terms of robbery rates, we see that pre-pandemic robbery rates were really not statistically significantly different from what they were in previous years, but during the lockdown, summer protests, and end of the year periods, we saw the robbery rates decreased. For auto theft rates, we find that during the pre-pandemic and lockdown periods, there wasn't a statistically significant change compared to previous years, but for the summer protests and end of the year, there was an increase in auto theft rates. Larceny rates, once the pandemic began, decreased compared to previous trends. And finally, burglary rates did not change in comparison to prior trends, except during this pre-pandemic period. So at the beginning of 2020, burglary rates were statistically significantly lower than they had been in previous years. But once the lockdowns began, we didn't notice a change in burglary rates. So based on our results, what do we want to conclude? Well, we first of all want to caution against advancing policy at this time based on the lessons that we're learning from the pandemic. One of the reasons for this is that typically crime types would be moving in tandem in terms of either all of their rates would be increasing or all of their rates would be decreasing. But what we find here is that crime rates by type did not move in tandem. So homicides increased, robberies decreased, etc. And so because of this, there's not necessarily a good theoretical reasoning for why we saw the results that we saw. We also examined in analyses that I'm not presenting here, the rate changes in relation to lockdown policies, that openness index that I was talking about earlier. However, we find that most of the crime rates changes were not very sensitive to the strictness of the lockdown policies, though robbery and larceny rates were. Again, happy to talk about this in the Q&A afterwards. We can only speculate on the causes of the changes and the lack of changes for various crime types. It's possible that opportunity is a partial explanation, though it's admittedly a post hoc explanation. So we can think about the idea that because people were in their homes more often, that there was less chance for certain crime types to occur, but an increased chance for other crime types to occur. But again, this really is just a post hoc and only partial explanation. It doesn't explain all of the results that we're seeing. In terms of what we would recommend for future work, we think that future work should focus on looking at more complete crime data than what we had access to. though we want to mention that we really struggled to find any more data than the data that we were able to find. And even the data that we were able to find had some issues in terms of, say, aggravated assault and rape, which were pretty inconsistently reported. We also believe that future work could examine crime rates in non-urban areas. So we were just mostly looking at large cities, but it'd be interesting to find out what was happening in suburban and rural areas as well at this time, and also look at later stages of the pandemic. So now that we're done with 2021, what happened in 2021 in comparison to 2020 and the previous years? Thank you for attending this webinar. And thank you to everyone who put on this webinar and made it possible. We have a paper that is going to be appearing in Statistics and Public Policy soon. We also have an old version of our paper available on arXiv, but my email address is given on this slide. It's just my first name at stat.cmu.edu. And I'd be interested in hearing any feedback or questions you have after this talk as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michaela. We would love to learn more about how your paper can translate into public policy in the future. So I thank you very much for your presentation. So now our last speaker of the event, Ms. Swan Elaine, if you can please share your screen and begin your talk.
Can you see my slide? Okay, cool. So hi everyone, I'm Ming Xuan. I'm a fourth year PhD student at USC Annenberg School of Communication and Journalism. Today, I'm very glad to be here to give a presentation on our project, Playing Through the Pandemic, Gaming Usage as a Buffer During the COVID-19. So today we're all gathered here to talk about our fight toward COVID. And indeed, the year of 2019 and 2020 will long be remembered as the era of COVID-19, where many lives were lost and the global economy was impended and all the daily norms were disrupted. Amidst all the disruptions of the COVID-19 pandemic, the video games were used heavily, surpassing all other media combined in terms of the revenue, presumably because it could help with the negative mood and social isolation. So our study seeks to understand the effect of such play on well-being with a particular sample World of Tanks players. And we're interested to learn whether different play patterns of change well-being outcomes for players. And was this a case of improving well-being or holding losses at bay? So our study drew on three strands of theories: the usage and grades theory, the mood management theory, and self-determination theory. So according to the mood management theories, media selection were driven by implicit and hedonic needs. So hedonic needs means excitement and stimulation. And if our media selection could satisfy the intrinsic needs, we will experience greater media enjoyment. And later, the mood management theory also incorporates non-hedonic needs in the intrinsic needs realm. And the three non-hedonic needs are autonomy, competence, and relatedness, which was originally proposed in the self-determination theory. According to the self-determination theory, humans have three basic psychological needs: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Satisfaction of the three will contribute to one's well-being and vice versa. And we also lean on the usage and gratification theory because this theory accounts for the broader socioeconomic and environmental factors that influence people's media use, such as how COVID-19 as a backdrop could influence people's media use. And drawing on these three lines of theories, we propose 6 hypotheses. So first, we propose that during the COVID-19, our players will report higher levels of current and future well-being compared to the national sample. So in February 2021, Gallup conducted a survey on national sample and asked the people's current and future levels of well-being. And one of our surveys was also conducted in February 2021, and we intentionally used the same scales of the current and future well-being that was used in the Gallup survey to do a parallel comparison with the national sample. We also predicted that people will spend more time in games during COVID-19 than pre-COVID-19. And people who play more will report higher well-being compared to those who play less. And this will be a larger relationship than the test prior to it. And then we really dive into people's like in-game behaviors, leveraging or access to people's in-game behavior log data. And we predict that people who engage in more social interactions during COVID-19 than pre-COVID-19 will report greater perceived relatedness. And players who perform better during the COVID-19 will report greater perceived competence. And increased play will have a stronger association with non-hedonic need satisfaction during the pandemic than prior to it. And last one is players' hedonic and non-hedonic need satisfaction altogether will be positively associated with their well-being. And we situate our study in World of Tanks. World of Tanks is a team-based online vehicle combat game allowing for individual and team play. So we work in cooperation with Wargaming, the developer of World of Tanks, so that we could get access to the North American servers players' in-game behavior data. And we conducted 2 waves of surveys. The first one was conducted in April 2019, and this represents the before COVID time. And the second wave was conducted at the late January and early February, and this represents the during COVID time. And February 2021 is near the peak of the US infection and death as reported by the New York Times. And we also matched the survey data with 10 months of behavioral data. So all the data were anonymized and one-way hashed before sending to the research team. And we're able to combine players' survey data with their in-game behavioral data using that one-way hashed player like spot key. So just more information on the game and on the player demographics. So because the game has a very rich historical background, it's situated in World War II, and it features more about strategic play than your reaction times. So it actually attracts a lot of like a wide range of the age. So you can see the age actually ranges from 12 to 80 something. And about 30% of our participants have served in the US Army. So sharing some of our key results here, broadly, our sample of players indeed reported higher levels of present and future well-being compared to the national sample. And our players represent already heavy players of the game. And among them, we did see a significant increase in the consistency of their play, but not their intensity of the play. And although we did see more daily gaming among our players, there was no relationship between this increased daily gaming and their psychological well-being. However, increases in their gameplay intensity were correlated with increased feelings of competence, which was in turn associated with increased psychological well-being. And players who felt higher levels of competence and hedonic need satisfaction during the pandemic were more likely to report higher overall levels of psychological well-being. So in conclusion, some takeaway messages. Gameplay in our sample provided a buffer against declines in well-being as a type of psychological maintenance, whereas our game appears to have delivered a psychological buffer for its players broadly. Perhaps more social and supportive environments will generate more positive outcomes for those seeking socialization, such as the game Animal Crossing during the COVID-19. But yeah, this is our team. And thank you for listening, and let me know if you have any questions or comments. Thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Wan. I really love these findings that you're presenting, especially when you mentioned that the intensity of the game was correlated or translated into better outcomes. So I would love to definitely learn more about that. But let me quickly share my screen so that I can share some other updates with you before we jump into the Q&A section. So first, I would like to end this presentation by thanking all the researchers who have shared their work with us today. For the audience, each of our speakers' presentations will be made available on our website, COVID Information Commons, and on our YouTube channel later this week. As we noted earlier today, those presentations will be giving additional accessibility features, including English and Spanish transcripts. And before we jump into the Q&A section, I want to also announce the Zoom webinar, which is a follow-up to this first thematic webinar about behavioral and social sciences insights during the pandemic. We also have 4 additional amazing, fantastic speakers who will be sharing their results of the research that they've been doing during this pandemic. So if you can please join, you can find the information in the chat and also on our website, and you can register at any time. This webinar is actually going to take place on June 10th at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. So we hope to see you then. And also, I would like to briefly share that please stay in touch with us by talking to us on Twitter, LinkedIn, our Slack, Instagram, and also emailing us if you can. This information also we share in the chat, and you also have the registration for the June webinar, which is a follow-up of this first thematic event. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to open it up to the Q&A section. The first thing I saw, there is a question actually from the audience. So I'm going to begin first with the audience. I always have a few questions, but I prefer to give the opportunity to the audience to address any questions or comments. So this first question is for Michael. This question from the chat asks, does your research take into account relationships between 2 individuals or non-monogamous couples? Is there a generational divide in how relationships sustain or promote mental health during the pandemic?
Interesting.
Several questions there. So we ask people about their primary partners, and we follow up questions over subsequent waves about primary partner by name or nickname. So there's definitely, the possibility that there are other relationships, other romantic relationships in people's lives during the time, but it's hard to map the relationship network of sort of polyamorous people and how that would change over time and who all the actors are. It can actually be, one of the things that we do in addition to nationally representative surveys is we do in-depth interviews. And so, our survey instrument is kind of sharpened through in-depth interviews. And one of the things we know about in-depth interviews is that people who have a lot of partners, the relationship history is incredibly complicated. And so we limit ourselves to the primary partner. For married people, of course, it's pretty easy to figure out most of the time who the primary partner is. The other question is, so it's a little bit of a cop-out there because relationship questions assume relationships of 2 people, and in the real world, life is often more complicated than that. We don't have the survey resources to make that more complicated picture real, but we do have questions in our survey about non-monogamy. So it's possible to figure out who the intentional non-monogamous couples are, but the full network of who all those other partners are is not known to us. So that's one thing. The second thing is, in terms of age, if you think about retired people, right? I'm going to use the word old here advisedly, but retired people are in a situation where the pandemic didn't affect them as much often because they were already at home most of the time, and because they weren't working and they weren't commuting. They don't have small kids at home. So a lot of our retired people who were married simply reported that not much had changed. So the changes of the pandemic were much bigger, I think, for the young single people who would ordinarily have been out and been going to the bars and the restaurants and the venues and enjoying downtown and all that kind of stuff. Those people were really at a disadvantage during the pandemic socially. And so the partnered people, especially and specifically the partner people who were living with partner, whether they were married or not, those people had a lot of solutions ready at hand for the problems of the pandemic, whereas the single people were really at a loss. And in our interviews, we found people who, the day the lockdowns were announced, like found a partner and moved in with them in order to be in a situation where they could be sheltered at home with a partner. So anyway, that's my long rambling answer to those two good questions.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And thank you for the question. I think I haven't checked the chat, but I believe that came from the chat. So I have one question also I'm going to jump into Ming's one first. I was really curious about your presentation specifically. I don't know if I missed something. I don't know if you did mention it, but I wanted to ask you specifically why your team selected the war game for this research, and whether or not is there any other research on other types of gaming rather than the war game during the pandemic.
Yeah, that's a good question. So we select the game mainly because like the first author has like a relationship with the gaming company, so that we were given access to the game's in-game behavior data, which was very important for us to see players' natural behavior in a commercial game, which was usually like confidential for other game companies if you have no like internal relationship with them. So that's why we are using what we have resources for to conduct the study, to be able to match players' survey data with their in-game data. And also because of our collaboration with the game company, we are able to, like the game company just directly send out like surveys randomly to their players. So the surveys will be more representative rather than if we send out the surveys by ourselves. We indeed have like have surveys in studying the game's performance, like or game's maintenance role during the COVID-19 for Animal Crossing. And that's based on like text data and players' self-reports on Twitter and Reddit, I think. And yeah, indeed, for Animal Crossing players, they were reporting a high level sense of community, and they feel like connected because they have access to this like very social game. So yeah, we think both social and competitive gaming could at least like hold losses at bay during the COVID-19.
And another follow-up question about that is like, do you find any specific characteristic of the people who were reporting better outcomes while doing gaming? Because I know overall, not everyone does well with these games. Maybe other people benefit from other techniques, other applications, other interventions. Like, I'm wondering, like, who are these people who actually do better when they were playing this game?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So we find like in general, players who play more intensely, like they were playing more battles in a given time, they report better competence, which contribute to their well-being. However, if we like separate players into younger and older parts, and actually they have different mechanisms. So older players, they in general report higher well-being regardless of their objective in-game performance, because their well-being comes from their sense of their performance. So if they feel they were engaging in strategic play and they were collaborating with others, regardless of the gaming outcome, they will report higher well-being. For younger players, they report well-being if they actually perform well in the game, if they are making more friends in the game, and if they win more in the game. So there are kind of different mechanisms there.
I really like that, especially linking to what Michael was mentioning about collaboration and working together. Like, we are dealing with this pandemic, but it seems that surprisingly, people actually are coming together and collaborating with each other. So I also like to ask if anyone in the audience have any other questions. I see something here in the chat. Lindsay, do you want to unmute yourself and ask? Yeah.
Sure. I was just going to follow up on that. I mean, as you were talking, I was thinking about the opposite directionality, right? So if you have unstressed kids who are happy, who have good social relationships, and I'm thinking about, you know, kids or adults too, then are they more likely to have higher confidence in the game, be able to build these, you know, friendships, be strategic, and then, you know, so you're maybe, is it possible that what you're seeing was the other direction?
Yeah, it's possible because we don't have like rigorously designed experiment data, so we cannot rule out that possibility. However, during the 2 waves of our survey, we indeed find that the connection between those 2 variables was larger during the COVID-19 for those who play more. So, and also for those who perform better. So this might kind of complement the picture, but yeah, that's very possible, I would say. Thank you for your questions.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Wan. And I want to open it up also to Florence, if you have any questions before I
Oh, you
continue.
know I do. Yeah, thank you. It's my favorite part, asking questions. So I actually first have an idea and a recommendation. And Kenya, I'm wondering what you think about this too, is that later this year, we're going to have a Kick Student Paper Challenge. We had one last year, and we had a number of, you know, students who participated. I'm thinking if you're interested, the speakers or anyone is here who would want to be maybe a mentor or actually create like a challenge, like, you know, maybe a prompt that you would like the students to consider in the Kick Student Paper Challenge. We're doing something similar with another program we have called the National Student Data Corps, where we have prompts in health and COVID and urban informatics and cybersecurity with AI and ML. We create some prompts in case they're like, I want to do this, but I don't really know where to start, or what should I do? Or there's so many options, you know? So what I would like to say is that we would welcome you if you're interested, and maybe Kenya would reach out later this year when we're getting ready for the challenge to maybe ask you if you'd like to provide a prompt, if you like to maybe mentor some of the students. It's just an idea. As I was listening to your work, especially like, you know, the gaming stuff, ooh, I bet you they'd be all over that. And the relationship stuff, depending on where they are in their journey, you know, because we have a community college and undergraduate cohort, and we have a grad school cohort. So we have people at different stages of their lives. So anyway, so we might reach out and ask you about that if you wouldn't mind, to see if you'd be interested in providing a prompt or mentoring or something. Okay, great. So then to the questions. So Lindsay, on my walk the other day, so this is anecdotal data, one of the daddies in the neighborhood was mentioning, knew his kid was 2 and now he's like 16, but he was saying to me that a lot of the athletes in high school are staying back a year. And he thinks it's because they want to do better in sports, like they went to a local Catholic school that's really good at sports, and then they're bringing them back in. And I'm like, it's not like they make money in high school. What's the big deal? So I said, are you sure it's not just because their parents don't think they learned enough? You know, I don't know if they think that it's because they're going to be a professional football player if they spend one more year in high school. So, you know, I'm wondering as you look at the implications of the mind wandering and how much did they really learn, are you actually aware of an increase in the number of high school students that, you know, are not graduating, and not necessarily communities where they're the first in their family to go to college? You know, it could be even worse, like if your parents went to college, they might be more competitive about, who knows? You know, so I'm wondering if you have any information like that. I just have that anecdotally, but this dad said, if I know one of these kids, I know 50 of them. Like, well, that's, you know, that's a big multiplier right there. If you know one, you know 50 in just one, you know, school. Have you seen anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question you know, sort of trying to think about this in terms of the timeliness piece. I mean, I think really there are 2 phenomena that you're, you know, noting here, and one of them is this increased, you know, competition for their child's success, right? This is a huge thing that many people are noting in different ways, and you see it in aiming to get their kid to be the top of whatever team it is in high school. And, you know, I think the gold ring is the college scholarship, right? So there's sort of this, you know, hope, or at the very least to get into a top college. You know, there's sort of this this push there, and there's this intuition that with greater age, I mean, you have greater size
And you're bigger, yeah.
you're bigger, you know, But there is also a cognitive piece, and so I always think about executive function first, and so
Yeah.
that is, your executive function develops all the way through mid-20s, and so there's real growth that's continuing to happen all the way through high school, and through college, really. And so, with kids, you can see these changes in attentional control and organization, and sort of ability to manage a lot of the demands in particularly a challenging high school context, or in addition to a high school context that's going on in the landscape of many stressors in your living context. So all of that is likely to be a little easier as you're older if you're being compared against peers who are, of a younger age. So I think there is partly this competitive drive piece. There's also a huge real phenomenon, which is that many kids had serious learning loss last year. And that was, in part due to all of the challenges I was talking about in terms of high technology, teachers' comfort and success with doing online learning, and I'm interested in this couples piece, the family and home dynamics. Some, were very conducive and supportive to learning, some were less so. And so anyway, there, just many intersecting complexities explaining greater disparities really in learning during last year. So you see, bigger learning loss in communities where you do have, typically greater challenges and sort of lower overall income streams. And, partly that's things like people being able to work at home, you've heard and thought about these many things. So anyway, so I think there are people who are trying to deal with those learning losses in different ways. And one may be this redshirting, and sort of taking that additional year and putting it in the name of academics, maybe that's something. I actually haven't heard of that happening as much as I've heard about schools really trying to foreground sort of, their curriculum to teach both this year and last year, right? Sort of to really build out the foundation for what they're trying to teach this year in ways that, don't require as much or don't expect as much prior knowledge for their students. So it's a really challenging place for teachers too, right? Because they're really trying to, and they're handling larger emotional needs and demands from students, and students are coming into schools. There are just many bigger emotion. We see a lot more distress and, disciplinary issues. And I mean, these are really on the much higher side than they were pre-pandemic. So.
Very interesting. Thank you. And I'm wondering, like, statistically speaking, when we look back, if the percentage of graduates is going to be different, this year versus, or in the last 3 years, then it's going to change, or it's permanently going to go this way, or whatever,
Right.
The average age for graduate. I don't know. It was just interesting when he said it. We were like, huh, that's interesting. I wonder why, I wonder if it is the red shirting for sports, or I wonder if it is, learning, or I wonder, so it sounds like it could be an interesting research topic in the future too, as we look back. I don't know what we're going to be sitting in 2 years from now, but it could be something even more exciting, with natural hazards and disasters increasing at the same time as we have pandemics. So that's very interesting. Thank you. Thank you for that. I had a question, Mingwan. One of the things that I was thinking, and as you know, when we did the prep session, I was like, wow, look at the age range here. That is so cool, right? And maybe gaming is like that. And in general, I actually don't do online gaming. I do Wordle. That's about it. I prefer to read research. I'm really such a geek. But I was wondering if that game, if is like a standard distribution of ages, or if that one, because of the war and the war theme and the veterans they're participating and the World War II effort, I don't know, is that like a broader range, or kind of a flatter distribution? And then I'm wondering if the cross generational aspect was different in that game or not. Like if that actually was something that made the older generation feel good that they were communicating with the younger generation, or something, from a generational perspective. It would have been like in our periphery maybe when you were doing the work, but I'm wondering if that could be a potential learning at some point if you were to look at it from that perspective.
Yes, definitely. So in terms of the age distribution in our game, we have a bimodal distribution, like there's a younger set and there's an older set, but the game itself is, I think it's an outlier among all the games, especially like competitive first person like shooter games, because all the other games, they were like very high speed and they were like excitement. So like games like Dota and League of Legends, their age distribution is very on the young side. So this game has been reported to have a like wide range of age distribution, and there's definitely like generation effect. And in fact, from the qualitative research, we know there's like intergenerational play, like you're playing with your family, younger generation or older generation, that will also contribute to their well-being. But we don't have quantitative data on it for now. But yeah, that's a future direction for us. In our team, we also have people studying this intergenerational play and also the age effect using like interviews and other qualitative methods to like dig more into this aspect. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. Yeah, and this may be not in the specific zone that you're in, but as you're probably aware, having this intergenerational play, even like, preschools, that are on site with adult care centers, where you create this more intergenerational environment. And as God willing, the age distribution is going later because people are living longer, that might actually be an interesting learning, that the gaming mechanisms are one way to actually do that if you can't do it physically, so it's just an interesting, another interesting angle, I think, that could lead to a broader view of what's going on from a social perspective.
Yeah, and from our survey, in the second batch of the survey, we asked like who you usually play with, and many people actually play with their family or their like offline friends, like play with those they know in person.
So even if they get to play with them, whether they win or lose, it's a good day, right? When you're grandpa or grandma sometimes.
Yeah.
So, right, so it could be, that's why they're happy. They don't care if they win. Actually, their grandchildren are talking to them, So it's interesting, the nuanced side of it, or the qualitative side underneath the quantitative, is always interesting too.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for answering those questions. I appreciate it. Back to you, Kenya.
Thank you, Florence, for those questions. I have also a question for Michaela. It was really interesting to hear your presentation about the homicide rates specifically, which I believe that was the one that you said that's where you saw the increase. So we saw an increase in homicides, not in robbery or any other types of crimes. And then you did mention that your paper, your findings says that it was not related to the strict lockdown that we had during the pandemic. So then if it was not because of the strict lockdown, which was a very abrupt change pre-pandemic and during pandemic, then what is the reason why we saw this increase in homicides? And I was reading, for example, some other researchers suggest that it was because of the social unrest, like what you mentioned with Freud, like during the pandemic, all these issues with the police. But I was wondering then, back to you specifically in your research, what is the relationship that you see between homicides, increasing homicides, and the reason behind that?
Yeah, so I should first clarify that when I mentioned that homicide and some other crime types weren't related to the strictness of the lockdown, what we meant was that we were looking at this openness index that we had created. And so trying to see if changes in that openness index were what influenced or were associated with these changes in crime rates. And we also then looked at like bi-weekly periods immediately after the lockdown for about like 10 weeks and tried to see if in any of those bi-weekly periods there were changes in crime rates. And so when I was talking about the relationship with the strictness of the lockdown, it's not to say so much that the lockdown itself wasn't related to a change in homicide rates. We were just saying that it wasn't related to, say, the strictness. So it wasn't the case that, say, during like the super lockdown portion of the pandemic versus the slightly less lockdown portion of the pandemic, it didn't seem to be related to just how locked down a place was. And yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, I feel like there's a number of reasons why homicides could have been increased as well. As someone who's not a criminologist and is just a statistician, the things that I'm speculating on are purely more anecdotal than anything else. But I would say also, besides the reasons that you're bringing up and besides the lockdown itself, we can also think of the fact that during the pandemic, as people were either losing their jobs or there were just like more financial hardships, there tends to be more stress than in people's lives. We can imagine that there's a world in which that could have also, led to an increase in homicides, possibly. People were also living with their partners. There are other papers that have looked at domestic violence during COVID lockdowns. And the relationships there. So again, we can imagine a world in which people, because they're living at home with someone who is unsafe, that could have also been a factor. We don't know from our analyses, just because we weren't doing anything that was experimental or trying to look at some kind of causal relationship, what the exact factor was. So we can think of a number of things that it really could have been. But I think it's also important to note that, again, we also saw an increase in homicides at the beginning of 2020 as well, before the pandemic even started. So it seems that there also could just be a general trend in increasing homicides, not even necessarily super related to the pandemic.
Oh, that's a great insight. Yeah, because I believe the reason why I ask you the question is because overall, that's what we think. Like, the pandemic brought all these issues and all these homicides, all these crimes. But it's really interesting to see that maybe those ideas that we have are not real. And it's good to have scientists to do the research to find the real thing that is happening. So I'm glad to hear about that. Is there any other questions from the audience? Lindsay?
Sorry, I just keep having follow-up questions on your interesting ones, but I was curious in related to that same point, how narrow your localization was, because I was thinking about Chicago, which is my former city, where I know that there were big disparities in how policing meant that lockdown strictness was enforced, so in some neighborhoods there was a lot more sort of policing, meaning that people were really locked down, whereas other areas were not as much. So I wonder whether if you went by neighborhoods or if you look by city or something like that, you might miss, some of the variation and actually sort of lived rules, in the way that they impacted people's lives.
Definitely. Incredibly interesting point. And we did consider this when we were thinking about like our openness index and these different analyses looking at the actual lockdowns themselves and how strict they were, not strict they were. We thought about the fact that, in some places, I'm from Indiana, and in some places in Indiana, they weren't really strictly following various mandates, not even just, lockdown ones. And so anyways, point being that we were looking at crime rates at a city level. So we weren't looking at the specific neighborhoods, and similarly, our lockdown measures were also measured on a city level. And so it's very interesting. I wish that we had some way to be able to look at how strictly something was being enforced, or have, basically some kind of metric. The closest thing that I can think of, which comes with problems of its own, is maybe looking at mobility data. So to see like how these lockdown, our openness index was related to people's mobility, and trying to see if there was, say, some correlation there, and using that as a metric for how strictly it was enforced. But again, this mobility data, I think, also kind of comes with problems of its own. So it's not a perfect answer.
Great. So thank you, Michaela, for your answers, and Lindsay for your question. And I also have one last thing for Lindsay. It was really interesting about what you were talking about, e-learning, stress, and specifically about adding interventions like mindfulness techniques. So I have seen, for example, that we move to e-learning during the pandemic in a way that we were probably not prepared to. And maybe all these psychological insights are great to incorporate into learning. So I was wondering about like, what are those techniques that you suggest for the general public that maybe professors might take from your research and maybe incorporate it into their learnings?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think we've learned a lot, I think a recognition of the problem of mind wandering is something that is not a new one. People have known, that you can't just give a super boring lecture, students are going to mind wander. However, I think that recognizing these, in particular for e-learning, the challenges of the sort of many distractions outside of your computer screen is something that really forces us, it really brings that into relief, So we have tried different things, and we've done similar things at the, fifth and sixth grade level. So in classrooms, which are younger kids who have less developed executive functions. And we see, lots of evidence of a few things. One is that drawing students' attention to something important right before it happens is a really good technique to make sure people are ready and they're actually noticing and attending to that. And so it can be as simple as just drawing attention. It can be things like giving them a mindfulness prompt, or, okay, take a minute, you have a lot going on, separate and focus. And so, giving students kind of this moment to bring that, bring their attention and sort of come to you is really useful. I think we also have found that having prompts that or visual information that allows you to catch up after you have mind wandered is another really important one. So if you are, going through, some of my work with K-12 is about math instruction. So if you're going through, problem solutions or describing problems, and your teacher is hoping that, the student's going to look at this solution and then look at that one and compare them. If you have the teacher go through a solution, take it away, go through the next one, take it away, then the student who missed that first one will have no benefit from any of that instruction that they're getting. But if you have them up there, left on the board, then the student can come back and be like, oh, and then the teacher has to do a little reminding to say like, hey, okay, remember, just like over here, so if it's there, though, they can catch up. The same thing, with things like instructions, right? If your instructions just are verbally presented and not made available, a student who missed them is going to lose a whole lot of the next instruction, or they may ask their neighbor, and then that causes trouble. That happens in classrooms, right? But we see that, in e-learning environments. We created an online learning environment that we were really trying to keep everyone kind of moving forward, and we didn't have back buttons in a few different places, and we got a lot of pushback and from students, and a lot of feedback that suggested like, we really want to be able to back up, and and that's very insightful and helpful as just sort of a small opportunity for, if you're mind wandering, to be able to go back and see that and catch up. And Zoom doesn't do that all the time, but if you have the transcript going, you can have that on the side, which allows you to at least catch up with some of the things that have been happening. So there's some of these resources that we have at our fingertips. They don't take more time, they don't take more money, but that actually can make a big difference in ensuring equity in what kids are getting out of and learners are getting out of a particular kind of instruction.
I love that, Lindsay. Especially, I think the e-learning brought to our attention the need of probably personalized education, of taking into consideration how people learn. We all learn in a different way, and probably that's what online learning has brought to our attention, like on our faces, like, hey, we are all different, like we can use different techniques so that people can learn something. So it would be great to maybe see how after the pandemic, maybe we can continue with this e-learning and facilitate that personalized education for students. So I really love it. Any other questions or comments? Florence? Yep.
Yes, I have two questions. Michael, I was wondering when Michaela was kind of talking about the homicides, and I was thinking back to your work, and I don't know that there's a correlation or if there's anything you wanted to mention, but I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about that based on the work that you've done. And so perhaps not, but I was thinking there may be something there that you wanted to share.
Well, homicide is a really rare outcome. So it doesn't tell us that much about what's going on in sort of the median person's life. I mean, it's a bad enough rare outcome that it's worth studying in detail. And I thought Michaela's paper was really interesting, but I don't, what I will say about it is that there's certainly a lot of news stories about how much crime has increased during the pandemic, which doesn't seem to be supported by the data. And I think that that's consistent with the gloom and doom predictions about how terrible everything might be that don't seem to be fully supported by actual reality. So those of us who work in the realm of actual empirical reality have an obligation to push back a little bit.
I think that's very wise. There's another effort going on right now that NSF has going on with OSTP, the Office of Science and Technology and Policy, regarding open knowledge networks and innovation sprint. And one of the things they were looking at as a topical area is health miscommunication. And as you can imagine, because of what we've been going through over the last 2 years, and it's very interesting when you bring up that perspective. Where's the data, and then can you actually validate the provenance of the data, and where did it actually come from, and who made it up or found it? So I shouldn't say it like that, but yeah. So that's one of the things we're looking at is. You have to be careful because data becomes religious. Interesting.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
emotional.
Everything is going to heck in a handbasket theory. It, fits a lot of people's prior perceptions, but it may not actually be true. I'll just tell you a little vignette from my neighborhood in San Francisco. My neighbors were up in arms about somebody had stolen the flowers out of their front yard, and what kind of person would steal flowers out of another person's front yard? I mean, it was an outrage. And then it turned out that somebody with a video camera found the culprit. The culprit was a gopher about yay big. So there's always room for people to catastrophize. And I think that undermines the actual resilience and social strength that we in fact do have.
I agree with you. Very wise comment. Thank you. And then, Michaela, you said mobility, a magic word. And I want to use this opportunity to, may I share my screen, Kenya? Is that okay? Okay, great. So in the COVID Info Commons, Kenya talked about this, and Lauren actually created this whole effort, our accessibility effort. But you'll see in the Meet the Researchers area, we have the COVID-19 Research Lightning Talks. And this is actually the PIs that have presented and actually the students who presented. So we have them in here because they did do the lightning talks, and they were, it's under our award. And one of them, Aditya, who is actually a high school junior when he participated, but he was also taking math classes at the University of Minnesota for 3 years because he decided in middle school he wasn't getting enough math, God bless him. So he had already been an undergraduate while he was in high school, and he participated in the challenge and he won 3rd place. But anyway, his research was on, I know, right? Isn't it great? I love when the brainiacs come toward us. I know, I love it. So actually his work is on human mobility patterns linked to COVID-19. And so Michaela, when you were talking about mobility, I'm like, oh, you might want to be friends with him. And this is actually also an example of how we have the English transcripts that we were talking about. So this will be underneath each of yours as well. And then we also have the Spanish translation, to increase accessibility. So I thought I would just point out Aditya. He's a great student and a great human, and he's happy to, work with us. He got so many new opportunities because of working with us. He met a new mentor that helped him with his research. They submitted a paper to Springer with him as the first author, God bless him, as a senior in high school. I don't know. I didn't check to see if it was accepted or not, but even to get to that point, is great. And he was offered, research support from another professor while he was speaking, and an internship the following summer at University of Wisconsin or something crazy like that. So anyway, if you're interested in looking at his stuff, it's available online. He may be interested in doing some other mobility, research. I just thought I'd share that. And that's one of the opportunities of the COVID Info Commons portal is you can go find this stuff and then, reach out to them, watch a 10-minute video. It doesn't take too long to see if there's something interesting. So I just thought I'd share that too.
Thank you, Florence, for highlighting our resources. I hope that the community and the audience can find it helpful. And I actually, if there is no other questions, I would like to close for today and thank all the speakers for joining.